So I started a new job recently, and because of the demands of the workload, it was time to say goodbye to my laptop and finally get around to building a PC for work. I wanted to make a case which looked like this very early Xbox prototype. Now this Xbox prototype was standard PC crammed into a metal X-shaped chassis, and that looked really cool. So I was like, wow, maybe let's build a PC like that.
Plus, in these last few months, a certain billionaire has been showcasing his obsession with the letter X. So I thought, what wonderful timing. This can be the perfect PC for Elon Musk and his army of followers.
Designing the bad boy was simple enough. Just some rough diagrams on Inkscape, label the sections, take some measurements, add the parts, and building it, right? Let me tell you, this is much easier said than done. Alright, let's take a look at the parts for the build. For the motherboard, I'll be using the B660 ITX board from ASRock. I used this because it was the cheapest ITX motherboard I could find, and it cost me about $151.69 US. Nice. For the CPU, I went a bit last gen with the Intel i5-12400. I could have bought the 13th gen processors, but they were more expensive at the time of purchase, so I went with the 12th gen instead. This should last me long enough. Since this is gonna be a compact project, I'm using the Noctua L9i cooler. This should more than adequately cool the CPU, and it does look pretty good. For the storage, I bought a 2TB SSD from Western Digital and 16GB of RAM from Corsair. For the PSU, I picked the Li SF750, a small form factor and is one of the cheapest modular SFX PSUs I could find. And finally, for the big boy GPU, I bought an RTX 3060 Ti.
Beninging.
Armed with the earlier design from Inkscape, I was able to build a small and then subsequently a larger cardboard prototype. Surprisingly, both these structures held pretty well even with just hot glue, and I was able to support the weight of the parts. So here I'll be adding the motherboard, this section will be the power supply, and over here will be where the GPU sits, the actual full build. Obviously for the real build I won't be using machine parts because, well, I can't afford that. But a cheap but decent alternative was just using wood and sticking it together using glue, nails and screws. While my end product may not look as polished as Microsoft's, as long as it stands, runs like a PC and looks like an X, I see that as an absolute win.
It's
Drilling
time.
As you can see, this diagonal cut of wood is really going to be the star of the show, as that is really going to show off this X shape of the PC. While most of the wood was bought pre-cut, other sections still need to be trimmed or cut further. So for that, I'll be using a handsaw for the build as well as a knife and some sanding paper. To hold the X shape initially, I was hoping glue would be enough. Maybe I didn't have the right kind of glue or a firm grasp of basic physics, but glue just wasn't doing too well. So I decided to cut some tiny strips of wood and use it as a support with two self-tapping screws to bind the pieces together. And that worked flawlessly. With the X shape of the front and back panel done, it's now time to tidy up the motherboard section. I'll be screwing in some standoffs for the board so I don't have to screw the board directly into the wood. With that settled and some nails in hand, it's now
Hammer time.
Now for the long piece of wood which will hold the GPU. Due to the wooden supports, I have to cut slots into the wood and reduce the overall length of the piece, as I got it quite long. With that piece cut and the slots done, we can get to hammering the piece. So check how the build is coming along. Alright, let's start adding the parts. We will start with the PSU first, as the part is at the bottom half of the intended system. We will start by adding a metal bracket to the PSU to be able to screw it into the system. The bracket's strength will aid in supporting the weight of the PSU. With the bracket on, we can start highlighting and cutting the wood for it to sit. And finally screw the bracket and the PSU in place. Flipping over the case, I can now get to adding our power button. I bought a pretty big button for this project, and I'll be using some hand-cut circular wood spaces to allow the wiring of the button to sit just under it. With some glue and double-sided tape, it now sits perfectly. Okay, right, now for the GPU part. Since I'm kinda designing this project as I go along, I need to see if the GPU has enough space to sit in the case. I'm also going to be using a PCIe 4 riser for this project, as the motherboard and GPU sit in different sections. Since the GPU would also sit in between the motherboard and the PSU, I cut two generously sized slots, one for the cables of the power supply and any other add-ons, and two for the PCIe riser. The initial plan was to just have one slot where which both cables could pass through, but the riser was too stiff and did not allow enough space for the GPU to sit. As such, the riser cable will be sitting externally like this. As usual, I'll be marking and screwing in standoffs for the riser to sit. With the riser now in place, we can add in the GPU and voila! It looks pretty good. Now for the rest of the PC. As is the norm, we start with the CPU. I follow the little triangles on both the CPU and the motherboard, put down the lever or bracket or whatever it's called, and now we can get jiggy with the thermal paste because the CPU is in place. As mentioned earlier, I'll be using the Noctua L9i for this build, so I used the provided thermal paste and the design pattern that was recommended in their manual. Also, thanks Noctua for including this really cool badge sticker thingy in all your coolers, I think, as a super classy way to accessorize the system. After the thermal paste, we can add the cooler and then carefully flip the motherboard to screw in the cooler to the board. With that done, we can now plug in the fan to the fan header and start adding the RAM to the system. With the RAM secured with the clicks, means now I can add the SSD. With that done, the brains of the system are now ready and it's now time to put it all together. Let's start with the motherboard section first. All we need to do is screw in the motherboard into the pre-added standoffs and ensure everything sits just fine. Flipping the case over, you can see that I've already cut sections into the back panel of the case to get to the motherboard I/O. Similarly, I have also cut slots for the PSU cable and power button. Since the PSU had already been attached to the system, we can start adding the power cables and connect the motherboard. This is when I hit one of my many snafus in the project. It seems that the 24-pin motherboard power cable is just a bit too short to reach the board. I kept trying, but you can see my disbelief in this clip. This led to an awful lot of frustration. The only solution, after many minutes of thinking, was to flip the PSU upside down. That way, the cable will be closer to the board and hence fit in position. To aid with that, I cut a bigger slot at the back for the PSU since now its power button will be pushed further up. The other thing I needed to change was the PSU ventilation. Since the earlier assumption was the PSU fan would be facing upwards, I drilled some ventilation holes into the panel that will sit up top. With the fan in the new configuration now pointing downwards, I had to drill ventilation into the bottom panel. This time, instead of speed holes, I decided to cut out a giant slot for the fan. This would provide much better airflow. Now, one observation I had after adding the motherboard section to the PC was that I was just a little bit taller than what my intended measurement was, so that meant I had to add like a smaller wooden piece on top of my current design so that I could, finish off the clean look of the PC. With that now done, all that's left is adding the GPU. Since the space for the GPU is quite tight, it is a bit of a struggle to get it down, but I had budgeted just enough space and it fit just about perfectly. With the GPU cables plugged in, all that's left is to plug in the motherboard cable and plug in the PCIe riser. Then we can turn over the PC and get it ready for testing. Let's connect the HDMI cable and let's plug in the PC to the mains. Then we can close up the PC, or kinda close up the PC, and start it. Thankfully the PC is turned on and we kinda have life. Let's turn on the monitor and see if it boots into a screen. And here we go. We can see the ASRock motherboard BIOS and we are into the BIOS. And yeah, the parts are running and it all looks great.
Since we're done with the testing, we can start making the PC look pretty. First, let's start hammering in all the remaining sections of the PC case. Then we can start erasing all of the marks that I've done on the PC. Since I put the power button on spaces, I'm just gonna color it black so that it matches the color of the button. Moving on from there, we need to cover any of the remaining ventilation sections with mesh. For this, I'll be using cut mesh and double-sided tape to make it look pretty. Since I cut slots into the back of the case, I'll be using these cut strips of brown paper along with double-sided tape to sort of make this section more defined. Right, now for the top sections of the PC. Due to my amazing measurement skills, the motherboard and GPU pop out of the PC. Additionally, the GPU section is completely open, so in order to maintain the complete X look, we need to add covers to the top and side of the case. Using some double-sided tape, wood, and mesh, I created these angle pieces to slot on top of the PC. These pieces are about 2 cm tall and help cover the exposed components. To attach these pieces to the main body, I screwed in some wood standoffs here. This will allow me to remove these pieces whenever needed. For the exposed side of the GPU, I'll be using this mesh panel made with wood and Velcro tape. Velcro tape will allow me to quickly and easily remove this panel from the PC when needed. I also taped the corresponding side on the PC, so you know the Velcro tape works. Looking good. Let's put all the final parts together, starting with the two head covers for the PC. I'm using self-snapping screws for this as it is pretty strong and it holds the PC with the part. I do the same on the other side and now one hat is in place. For the GPU side, I decided to plug in the HDMI cable first as it would be pretty hard to reach once the hat is in place. After arranging the cable to go in between the slot and in the hat, I can screw the hat in place. I had to use 3 screws because of the positioning of the slot. With the hats now in place, I can close the PSU section. And then Velcro on the GPU mesh section. And with that, we're done. Now for a final test as the finished product to see what it looks like through all the mesh. Seeing it successfully boot into the BIOS is a relief. I had been scared since the GPU seemed to stress the wood panel and the lack of space between it and the PSU made any adjustments pretty impossible. But it works and all the parts are showing correctly, and the RGB through the mesh looks pretty dope. So this is it then, an X-shaped ITX PC that would be ideal for Elon Musk and looks like if the original metal Xbox prototype was bought from Wish. Even though it didn't turn out as elegant as I envisioned, it stands, runs like a PC and looks like an X. All of my basic criteria are met. I learned quite a lot through this process and realized that my measure it once and YOLO strategy is not always the best. Working with wood was also pretty challenging due to the nature of equipment I had. There are several avenues where I could improve on for future projects, like using better quality and thicker wood, measuring with the components and perhaps 3D modeling a prototype so I don't need to create random parts as the build progresses, using magnets instead of Velcro for a sleek, cleaner look, and just having proper wood cutting equipment. I also forgot to add something for the bottom of the PC. Maybe you can add some extra wood or cover it with mesh, but since it lies pretty flat on the floor, this part doesn't really matter. Even if there are several times I wanted to nuke this project, I'm happy I made it work. After all, janky projects are my thing. Thanks everyone for watching, please like and subscribe for more, and I'll see you guys in the next one.